This episode of Over a Barrel is brought to you by Valero. Night or day, rain or shine, Valero keeps the pumps full 24/7, 365 with a reliable fuel supply. Because keeping pumps fueled keeps business pumping and communities moving. Right now. Coming up on Over a Barrel, tariffs may be paused, but find out why gas prices may be poised to go even higher. We've got that and a lot more on Over a Barrel, which starts right now. Welcome to the program. That's Patrick on the other side of the screen. Howdy. I am Matt. Hello. And how are you today and tonight, whenever the time may be? Thanks for joining us here on Over a Barrel. And before we go any further, make sure that you like or subscribe. Do all of the stuff to any one of the channels that you are listening or watching us on. It's been a fun time with Over a Barrel, and we've got a lot more to come. And so we're very thankful for that. And thanks to you for listening and watching. All right, Patrick, you are not in your office today. I am mad at you because you are in warmth.
I'm in warmth, but the gas prices aren't, to your tease in, which was delightful. A lot of questions have come up on the tariff pause. I actually was able to fill up all the way to Florida, which is where I now am, for below $3 a gallon. In fact, some of the stations, Matt, a bit of a price war outside Chattanooga, where I filled up for just $2.49 a gallon. So, if you're listening, and if you still have access to some of those sub $3 prices, Matt, I think you may have some access to those. Enjoy them, because gas prices, I know the tariffs are paused, into it here in a minute, but sub $2 prices are going to start disappearing.
Yeah, that's you are not bringing.
Did I say sub $2 prices or sub $3 prices? Well, there's not many sub $2 prices any, but
You're finally coming around to my way of thinking, Patrick. $1.99 a gallon. I'm just saying. No, I in my earpiece, I think I heard sub $3 a gallon.
Okay, that's definitely what I meant to say.
But yes, at any rate, the prices are apparently moving in the wrong direction if you are wanting to be a miser when it comes to spending on gasoline and other fuels. All right, so the $2 a gallon mark slowly disappearing. Is this a normal response because we're into February and we're moving toward March and the spring, and you and I have talked about this on other podcasts, or are there other underlining issues there that are not usual that's creating some problems? I mean, we have teased the idea of tariffs, so talk to us about all of this. Break it all down for us.
Well, the good news is the tariffs, at least for now, are paused, Matt. So that would have hit a lot of folks in the Great Lakes really hard. We've covered that, as you mentioned. The Great Lakes, the Midwest, the Rockies are very reliant on that Canadian crude oil. But the good news is tariffs paused on Canada and Mexico. But while tariffs may be paused, gas prices are not paused. So let's make that distinction, right? The impact from tariffs is on pause. But there's still a lot of things, as we've covered, that impact gas prices all at once, right? There's not just one thing at a time that happens. There's a culmination of factors, and we are getting into those seasonal factors. It is starting to warm up. I don't know about you, but I went from 30-degree icy weather to 80-degree weather. I wish spring and late winter would just get over for the rest of us, but we are about to make the transition as a nation in the next couple of weeks over to summer gasoline. In fact, if you're listening in Southern California, that has already happened, the first step to the transition in summer gasoline. And we've covered that map before, the map that shows the speed of the transition, but that is starting now, Matt. And refineries also started maintenance. And while you're doing maintenance, it's kind of like getting an oil change in your car, except with the fact that refineries usually have several units. You can't really do maintenance without impacting supply, and that is usually what starts gas prices to go up, is because while that maintenance is happening, not as much supply is being produced. At the same time we're transitioning to summer gasoline, at the same time demand is going up, and that's about to kick significantly. In fact, where we are today, the national average at $3.14 a gallon. That's the highest already since October. Matt, I think prices are going to go up if you're ready for it. Gas prices are going to go up probably in the ballpark of 20 to maybe as much as 60 cents a gallon over the next, we'll call it 8 to 10 weeks, maybe 8 to 12 weeks. So there it is. There's the headline. is tariffs are paused, but gas prices are not.
All right, so I don't like you now. We are friends. We've been friends for a good number of years, but right at the moment,
I
what
don't
you
like
just
me either, Matt. I'm
what
just
if
going to
what?
go to
Yeah,
the gas station and make them freeze that price.
yeah. I mean, up to 60 cents a gallon, because in journalism that's what we do, because we're limited on
Of
time and
course,
how
we
we say
forget about
things.
the low range.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, you said 20 to 60, but in my brain, all I hear is like up to 60 cents a gallon. So I'm doing the math in my mind and going, I'm not happy with this. Stop it.
No.
So, all right. So talk to me about just a little bit some of this. The we so much is happening week to week between our podcasts. It's almost to the point where we need to do 2 a week or 3 a week at this
I
point.
feel like you're not wrong. We're at all the headlines and trying to digest, and that's been, by the way, the number one question is, people. There's probably a lot of folks out there that are looking at the pump. And by the way, here in Florida, gas prices did just cycle. That's a normal thing that happens every week or two. Michigan also just saw a price cycle up to 309. So if you're listening and you just saw your prices get jacked up by 20 or 40 cents, that actually has nothing to do with the tariffs at all. A lot of that, Matt, has to do with the fact that, keep in mind, we are already talking about summer gasoline, but what happens to the remaining winter gasoline? That's kind of the question that we can answer here. And, I had been calling for a big jump in prices in the Great Lakes really for the last week or two. But then you look at the amount of gasoline, Matt, that's been sitting in storage, right? Over the last 3 months, winter gasoline has been the primary fuel made by refineries. But as we're making this transition, that gasoline has to go somewhere. It has to get out of the system. And so essentially what happened in the Great Lakes in the last week in some areas of interior states is refineries are basically offering that winter gasoline at a clearance price because they have to get rid of it. They only have about 2 weeks more time. Then that gasoline is stuck. It can't be sold. It does not meet specifications. So what essentially happens is, Matt, this is like, when summer's over, swimsuits, bathing suits, clearance rack, boom. Easter candy the day after, boom, clearance rack. Boom, clearance rack is what is happening to gasoline in some areas of the country. Refineries are getting rid of it at very, very low prices. So those low prices are about to slingshot higher in a lot of states when you start making the transition.
Yeah, it's yeah. All right. So thank you for making my day.
You're welcome.
I know. I've traveled a lot again this week, and I did keep tabs this week. 1,700 miles that I have driven in 6 days. And then as soon as we get done with this podcast, I have another couple hundred miles to drive today and a couple hundred miles to drive tomorrow. So the fuel, I'm very price sensitive about that, because when you drive 1,700 miles in a week, video production and all of that stuff, up to 60 cents a gallon times X
That's a big amount.
It adds up very quickly. So this is
the average fill up between now and spring or summer is going to be $6 to $10 more. The numbers are going to move faster. You're going to look at the pump. I know. When I filled up for 249 the other day, man, it felt great because I got a full tank and it was only like $30.
Yeah. Well, $30 is what I averaged, because I part of that trip, I made a trip down to Atlanta and back this week. And when I filled up here in Kentucky to start the trip, I paid like $2.49 to $2.59. When I got back 48 hours later, about 55 hours later or whatever, it was $2.89.
You also price cycled in Kentucky in some areas, and that does spread. Paducah is not really one of the very strong markets for price cycling. Again, we've talked about price cycling. Louisville, Lexington are really the markets where you see it more, because they're kind of stations that exhibit cycling are used to. Stations are all shopping each other, meaning they're all looking at their competition's price. So why I say that's important, because big cities are very used to having to shop more of their competitors. And when one competitor suddenly goes up in price, the other ones may be like, well, yeah, our cost has gone way up, so we're going to do that. So this price cycling tends to be adopted in larger cities faster because there's more competitors nearby. And gas stations are often either driving by their competition, they're calling their competition to try and find their price. So generally speaking, in bigger areas, you can see the prices cycle faster. But in your market, it may take another day or two for what happens in some of those larger markets to spread all the way to like an area like Paducah.
Yay.
I mean, you get kind of a 24-hour heads up, right? And that's, by the way, how it works in the Great Lakes. Michigan just cycled up to 309 the other day, and we are still waiting. If you're in Indiana or Ohio, the same thing will probably happen here soon. As soon as that winter gasoline is gone, Matt, you're going to slingshot probably a bit higher. Now, the interesting thing is all of the tariff talk, Matt, all of the talk about this clearance sale on gas prices, the price of oil, my goodness, it's been just all over the map.
Well,
It
yeah.
was December, it was down to $68 a barrel, Matt. Then shortly ahead of Trump's administration, it jumped to $80 a barrel. And now we're all the way back down to 70. These tariffs have done a number. They've probably shortened the average trader's life by 5 years trying to figure out if
Yeah.
the tariffs are going to happen. But now, as we stand here today, oil is only up 11 cents, Matt, but which is only about a fifth of a percent. But the wholesale price of gasoline is now perfectly up 1%. So
Okay.
you're going to see that disconnect. By the way, the price of oil is not always the best mechanism to watch for what we're expecting at the pump. So expect gas. And by the way, we also had a refinery fire in Southern California worth mentioning. I got a call from British Columbia, Vancouver, saying, "Hey, why are gas prices going up in British Columbia?" Yes, believe it or not, a refinery fire in Southern California impacts the entire West Coast. So if you're listening in California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, if you're in Las Vegas, if you're in Phoenix, you may have seen a slight bump at the pump. And a lot of that is associated to a relatively small refinery, about 150,000 barrels a day, that caught fire in Martinez, California. And basically, as a result of that, that refinery is going to start maintenance earlier. It's kind of like your engine blows up. Well, you might as well get the work done now, right? So
Yeah.
usually when something like that happens, it solicits a refinery to start maintenance earlier.
All right, so let me. We've talked about tariffs. We've talked about the fact that they were on pause for now. Actually sent you a link to a story, I believe, in the Financial Times a couple of days ago regarding Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. I have
Here
some,
come the politics.
I have some questions for you that involves basically the longer term price point of Midwest gas prices, fuel prices, because of this upset, if you will, in the apple cart between our neighboring countries and the United States with these tariffs that are on again, off again, on pause for 30 days, whatever the case may be.
Whew. Yeah, you and I
They
both.
the Canadian government is
Right.
now calling for becoming more diversified in who they sell oil to
Can you
for the
blame
long
them?
term. Can't blame them, but here's the question mark that I have. They have been landlocked when it comes to, according to this story, I should say. You can correct me if the story is wrong, but I'm regurgitating somebody else's reporting here. But the fact of the matter is they've basically been landlocked, and they have been selling their crude oil at a discount to the United States, which then, as you and I have talked extensively about, kind of gets filtered down into the Midwest portion of the country to most degree. It's not 100%, but whatever the case, which kind of has given us, Lord, I don't want to say artificially low prices in the Midwest,
Right.
but compared to
Yeah.
the coastal areas, certainly at a discount versus where folks in other places of the country are paying higher prices. So if they follow through with their more diversification of who they are selling crude oil to, with building pipelines and whatever the case may be, and this is obviously not an overnight situation, but rather a more long-term focus, what does that have an impact on when it comes to Midwest prices? Are we in, long-term wise, here in the Midwest, are we
Yeah.
in for a mental transition that will be forced upon us, where when it comes to driving, we're just going to have to get used to paying higher prices?
Yeah. This is the part that worries me, is because what's happening here with tariffs, is it justified? I don't know. But at the same time, it's leading to these natural thoughts that the Canadians have: is, why are we tolerating this? Why don't we find somebody else to sell to? Just for the same reason that your smartphone, right? Apple, a lot of smartphone companies, a lot of technology companies in the last several years have started building factories outside of China to diversify their own sources, right? Because when there's a trade war, when there's politicians that don't see eye to eye between the U.S. and China, the smart thing is to build factories somewhere else where they're not at risk, where your company's not at risk. And so the natural thing for Canada is to potentially build more pipelines. They already built one pipeline called the Trans Mountain Pipeline that connects from Alberta to Vancouver. The good news for Americans is that only carries about 880,000 barrels of oil per day. But that is the risk, Matt, is the U.S., President Trump is giving Canada the opportunity to say, maybe it's time we sell our crude oil more on the international market, so we're not just at risk of whatever our relations with the U.S. So absolutely, you bring up a great point, and you can't claw that back. It's out there now. President Trump has said that Canada is now thinking, how do we get away from being reliant on the U.S. and that's a huge risk for us in the Midwest.
Don't touch that device. We've got more Over a Barrel coming up right after our sponsor, Valero.
All across America, you'll find Valero at your go-to gas station, volunteering with local charities and fueling communities 365 days a year, so you can always get where you need to be, right now.
And now for the rest of Over a Barrel.
Now, I will say of that discount, because Western Canadian oil today, we just mentioned a barrel of West Texas Intermediate oil, about $70. Canadian oil today is probably, if I were to check, it's probably below $60. The refineries in the Great Lakes often will absorb some of that. They'll do better because they'll basically take some of the discount and their shareholders will enjoy some of it. But that's also why the last price cycle in Michigan was only to 309, whereas in Florida, the last price cycle I just mentioned was 329. So Michigan right now, the Great Lakes has a pricing advantage, and you're exactly right. The big worry is if Canada builds more pipelines, which they could. One of the big holdups lately, Canada has a lot of reservations, and a lot of indigenous groups have, property where these pipelines would theoretically flow. And one of the indigenous groups that was blocking the building of a pipeline recently decided to change their position from adamantly against it to saying, okay, in light of what's happened, we're rethinking our position. And guess what, Matt? I think that Canada may, especially because of the tariffs, that is going to act as a catalyst. And Canada is now going to say, we are going to build more of our own pipelines. We are going to start seeing more competition for Canadian oil, Matt. And that's going to affect motorists in the Rockies, in the Midwest, and the Great Lakes. Those areas the most, because refineries in those areas are the primary beneficiary and the primary recipients of the 4.5 million barrels of oil that Canada sends us every day. So I can, you're a business owner. When somebody threatens your business, when something threatens your business, like tariffs, for example, tariffs are going to cause, and you already saw a lot of this, right? The Wall Street Journal, CNBC was reporting that countries that are very, impacted by the tariffs are going to build, they're simply going to adjust. They're going to build wholesale centers in other areas so that they can avoid tariffs. Canada is going to do things that avoid potential tariffs on U.S. energy. And one of those things is simply building pipelines to the coastal regions. And that's exactly what's being talked about now, is Canada could build those arteries that help them diversify themselves away from the U.S. And that's
so
going to hurt Americans.
The question mark for a general consumer is going to be, well, fine, Canada, do whatever you want to do. We'll just pump different types of crude from someplace else into those refineries across those areas impacted and help mitigate the price. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, it's kind of like, Matt, your car, when you do an oil change, your manufacturer has built that car for a specific type of oil, right? Your car has been engineered to run on a certain type of oil, and you can't just up and change that overnight, right? Without catastrophic consequences. Refineries are similar in a way. They, over time, right, since they were built, not all oil is the same. Not all oil is the same. Crude oil quality is vastly different. That's why it's called crude oil. It's crude, and it depends on where it's being pumped from, what the characteristics of the oil are. As it so happens, because Canada has been the primary source of oil to the Midwest and the Great Lakes for a long time, those refineries are specifically adept at refining Canadian oil, which is very heavy. Now, the U.S. produces a lot of light crude oil, extremely light. It's easier to refine into things like gasoline. But the problem is, Matt, these refineries over the years have built up more and more ability to refine more Canadian oil
because of stability,
so
right?
They don't have the ability.
I mean,
they don't have the ability to just light switch it and just change the type of oil. They would have to make huge investments
because it seemed like a safe bet.
It's a complicated.
It seemed like a safe, up until
it has been. It has been up until the prior 6 months. So why would you change the status quo when it's working really well? Now the status quo is at risk, and refineries have not been spending billions of dollars to modernize anyway, right? It's been a very boom bust cycle. So, this could hurt the Midwest, and refineries just can't change the type of oil they're refining overnight. Within some small degree, they could, right? They can tinker a little bit, but when your refinery is processing 90 to 95% Canadian crude oil, you could maybe whittle that down to 80 or 85%, but you certainly can't whittle it down to like less.
So
than
the key for everybody in the Great Lakes, Midwest, the Rockies.
Rockies.
This is something to actually take note about. And again, it's not an overnight thing, but could be long term if Canada goes through.
Yeah.
Keep in mind some things. If the status quo for a foundational price point of how you move and transport goods, yourself in a car, and other aspects begins to fundamentally change, where for the long term, the idea of a lesser price for fuel is now out the window and it's not coming back, that you are going to have a transitionary period in more than just the fuel that you're putting in your vehicle. You have transportation costs. You have regional transportation companies that will have that are in the Midwest, the Great Lakes, and maybe they move goods back and forth. Buy local is a lot of the things that a lot of people do. Well, you're going to have a different price point at that point because those vehicles have to then fuel with a more expensive fuel, diesel in that particular case. But you have all of these things that maybe you don't stop and think about. Even airlines, whenever they fuel up in St. Louis, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, price is probably a little bit different than if they fuel up in Los Angeles. And so the key...
You are 100% right. And, let me just, to your point, let me just give folks some sort of idea. The difference in jet fuel prices right now, the cheapest place to fill your jet up today is the Great Lakes, primarily because there's little demand because it's so cold. So the difference, Matt, the Gulf Coast jet fuel prices right now are 7 cents a gallon more. And when you're filling up like a 777, that 7 cents a gallon adds up. And when you're filling up hundreds of flights a day, that 7 cents is massive. So, like I said, the Great Lakes, call it the Midwest, is the cheapest spot. The Gulf Coast, say Dallas, Louisiana, is about 8 cents more. And then you look at New York, the Northeast, really the East Coast and Mid-Atlantic, they are 16 cents a gallon more than the Great Lakes. So imagine filling up in Chicago versus JFK right now is 16 cents a gallon difference between the two. And then, Matt, going out to LA, LA is only about 8 cents more than the Great Lakes as well. So right now, if you're flying a ton of flights out of JFK, you're paying a lot more. So to your point, what it's called is tankerage, where planes will fly deliberately with more fuel. Now, airlines do these cost analyses a lot because essentially you'd be carrying extra fuel just to save 8 cents. That doesn't make sense, especially because there's a cost of that weight, right? If you're loading up a plane with fuel, you're also spending energy, you're spending more jet fuel to basically get cheaper jet fuel. So not all of it makes sense, but when jet fuel prices in New England and the Northeast were like $6 a gallon in 2022, you absolutely had flights that were from Chicago O'Hare to JFK, and the airlines were probably packing additional fuel to reduce the amount of fuel that they needed to buy at JFK, because the difference may have been, back in those days, it was like 50 cents a gallon. And I remember sharing some statistics about filling up a 777, Matt. We were talking about over $100,000 to fill up a plane. Yeah. So to your point, and by the way, there's these regional differences too in gasoline, heating oil, diesel prices, right? It's all different.
So the key, and I wonder sometimes if between that and probably landing fees at, say, St. Louis International, Lambert,
the big airports.
Lambert, St. Louis International, for example, whenever I buy a plane ticket there, it is usually quite a bit cheaper than some of my other international airport options, like Nashville, for example. Sometimes now I recognize there's competition. You have different, airlines flying maybe the same route or whatever to the same airport, and so you've got competition. But strategically speaking, the vast majority of flights out of St. Louis have always been cheaper for me than flying, per se, out of Nashville or Paducah or Evansville or Cape Girardeau, Missouri, or I have like 5 airports that I can choose from within a couple of hours drive of where I'm at. So the key for me is like, okay, what's most cost efficient for the business? Well, some of that may start disappearing pretty quickly if we start seeing, the price point. The other aspect is, will we see trickle down? In other words, does gasoline from the Midwest that's processed get put into a tanker and shipped across the Gulf into like the port of Tampa, for example? And will all of that have to also be trickled down? And I don't know the answer to that, but do you?
Yeah, you would not find gasoline from the Great Lakes making its way down to Tampa. It's just it's too long and difficult and pricey of a path. Not to make it too complex, but the units that pipelines charge, because pipelines are delivering
Right.
fuel from point A to point B, that fee is also generally called a tariff. And generally, pipeline tariffs, you'll have to pay, right, certain amount of cents per gallon to move gallons of fuel from one area to another. And so your hypothetical example of the Great Lakes, there's probably pipelines that could, generally the flow would not be from the Great Lakes down to the south. There are pipelines that could probably do it, but that's a long way to send fuel. And it's not very cost effective when Florida can get jet fuel and other gasoline, diesel on a barge. A barge is probably, it's definitely not as efficient as a pipeline, but it's definitely cheaper than getting
Yeah.
gasoline all the way down.
It's
So,
good to know.
and keep in mind too, yeah, a lot of that fuel in the Great Lakes and the Midwest is landlocked, and that's also why that fuel today, like I mentioned, Chicago jet fuel is very cheap because right now apparently there's plenty of it, and there's not a very easy ability to get that jet fuel in other markets. So, and there's always going to be a little bit of a difference between the regions depending on supply and demand balances in those regions. But to your point, if Canada suddenly starts seeing more demand for their Canadian crude oil, that's going to support a higher price. It's not necessarily going to match one-on-one with, a price of West Texas Intermediate crude oil, but all of these different oils have different prices depending on their characteristics, depending on where the oil is physically located. Is it in Canada? Is it coming from the Middle East? Right? The beauty is that the market is pricing all of these oils differently based on the quality, the desirability, where it's located, right? So if there's a similar type of oil in Texas or the Middle East, there may be a price difference as well. So it's a tremendously complex market. But getting back to the Canadian crude oil, I've heard a lot of things, why don't we just use more of the U.S. crude oil? Well, again, because U.S. crude oil tends to be lighter and sweeter, and your refinery is configured to process heavier, sour crude oil. So that's just something, again, you can't change overnight. It's like having a house in
The
the
key,
South.
though, they would say, though, is it can be changed, right? So to play as an
It can be
advocate on that
with
side of
investment.
mindset, they would say, but it can be
It it it
changed.
it,
It may not happen overnight.
it can be generally at
Right.
great cost. So there's different environmental rules, regulations, restrictions. There may not be a highway or a pipeline to deliver that crude oil from West Texas up to Chicago. That would need to be built. Then the refinery would have to reconfigure itself. The other difficulty is a refinery may not want that crude oil because that crude oil produces more products that they don't want. Like gasoline is not in short supply in Chicago, right? I just told you how much excess supply there was. So why would a refinery in the Chicago region, they wouldn't want to produce more gasoline? And that is exactly what lighter crude oil will do, is it will yield more light product like gasoline, like naphtha, which is a component for gasoline. So keep that in
So keep
mind.
in. Go ahead.
Refineries use a specific type of crude oil because it will also yield a specific type of product. And that heavy oil, the BP refinery in Northwest Indiana is I think the largest asphalt producer in the US. Why? Because they use a lot of heavy Canadian oil, which produces more heavy asphalt, more heavy, bunker oil, marine oil, diesel fuel, heating oil, right? And if they start refining a lighter oil, who's going to start suddenly producing more of that asphalt that's relied on, right? So you have to remember everything is a give and take. There's a supply and demand balance. And if BP were to suddenly reconfigure that massive refinery, they'd have a lot different things coming out of it too. And that may not be beneficial depending on what they're trying to produce
And I
more
mean,
of.
let's face it, every state, but pretty much Illinois, likes to have nice, smooth roads. Yeah, I'm talking to you, IDOT.
I don't, yeah. How many states right now are like, fix the
Right.
roads? They're awful. And by the way, when I got down to Florida, I mean, Florida's got some great environmental, conditions, but some of their roads
Right.
aren't great either, So every state has its challenges. But again, yes, there's a lot of conversations around Canadian oil. There's a lot of complexities that people don't realize, that it's not as simple as just let's put oil into the refinery, right? Because what you put in will change what you
Yep.
get out. And that's a complexity that a lot of people don't
So to
seem to
bottom line
understand.
this, because I know we're basically running out of time here, Patrick. To
Yeah.
bottom line this, for those who are curious about all of this, please be informed that a tariff is not involved in the cost of actually getting oil out of the ground. It's literally a fancy word for a tax. And the tariff doesn't go to the pockets of the oil companies, the refineries. It doesn't go to the pockets of really anybody other than the government. And so keep in mind all of these things.
Exactly, because the government is assessing it. Exactly. So it's a line item. It's a line item that the refinery, whoever's buying oil, is going to have to pay that line item that goes to the government. So it doesn't matter, to your point, Matt. You could call it a tariff, a tax, a special collection fee. It's something that's being paid by the refinery that is going to impact how much they're paying for their oil, which is going to impact how much they sell the things that are derived from that oil to you, me, and all the airlines and logistic companies and more. So a tariff is going to be, in essence, paid by all of us as we fill our tanks with oil that costs more.
See, this justifies why in business I don't do more than a 30, 60, and 90-day outlook, and the 6 month is literally like throwing a dart at a
boom, something that happened that you didn't expect.
A dart at a dart wheel there on the wall. I mean, it is what it is. 30 days I can almost make happen. 60 and 90 definitely more of a let's see if we can steer it in this direction, and then be ready to pivot because things change so rapidly. Anybody that does a 1 year and 2 year outlook, basically to mostly get a small business loan or something, it's just on paper because, good Lord, there's no way. Life is moving too rapidly to be able to not have to have that finger on the pulse.
It's impossible to predict, and that's why we break it down for you on a daily basis. But ultimately, keep in mind, Matt, to kind of put a bow on this, that while tariffs are paused, we still fully, and previously before tariffs, we were even a conversation, even last year, we fully anticipate that gas prices are going to rise seasonally. They do every year, just as they'll go back down in the fall. So keep in mind, tariffs may be paused, but gas prices are still going to go up that 20 to 60 cents a gallon between now and mid-April. And that has to do with all the seasonal factors. Americans are going to be driving more. Hint, hint, I just did that on the way to Florida because it's getting warmer. But we're going to see more of that as spring comes. Refineries will be starting to do their seasonal maintenance, and we're going to transition to summer gasoline. All of that happens at the same time. That creates kind of a super surge in gas prices. Prices won't peak in the summer, Matt. They will peak in mid to late spring, and then we'll start to see some relief. So tariffs are paused. That doesn't mean gas prices aren't going up, because we absolutely expect that they will go up.
You know, if we weren't friends before this episode, I wouldn't like you very much right now. I just want to throw that out there.
There's a lot of folks that don't like the news I have to bring, but you know what, Matt, if you want to go out and buy a little bit of gasoline to offset it, you're more than welcome to do that. But that's probably not a smart strategy.
Well, Patrick, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us here on Over a Barrel. We are so glad that you were, here and out and about. Make sure that you like, subscribe, keep following us on all the different channels. And of course, as things progress in all of these things, because I'm sure this conversation is not totally done.
It's not done at all.
We're going to be having to discuss this for a hot minute. So we will, of course, keep you up to date on all of those things right here on Over a Barrel. So for Patrick and myself, you have yourself a great week, and we will talk again coming up really soon.
See you later.
This episode of Over a Barrel is brought to you by Valero. When you make the call, Valero's there to answer with 24/7 U.S.-based customer support. Because we believe you should always have the fuel you need when you need it, right now.